Hey guys, welcome to this video. Today I'm going to be talking about developing as a poker player. I created a bunch of slides for this just to explain everything a bit more clearly and just make sure that I kind of stay on track with how we're going with this one. So, different phases and components of poker. So there's basically a few things that I'll probably say are like the phases or like the different components that we have when it comes to poker. So there's the basics, there's the risk management, there's the mathematics, the understanding of ranges, psychology and game theory, and then there's also the strategy development and execution aspect of things. And then the most important one, which is emphasized again and again by a lot of books, is mental game, and it's there for a reason. It's often one of the more neglected parts of it, and we'll kind of get into all the different parts of how to basically break each component down so that you can figure out what kind of phase you're in terms of your development and what kind of things you might be missing. So basics, so rules of the game that you're playing obviously are the most important. So you could be playing No Limit, Hold'em, Pot Limit, Omaha, or you could play another like mixed type of game like Deuce to 7, Triple Draw. The main things in like all games I'd say are like the effect of hand strength and rankings and understanding how hands are ranked in that manner. So for example, we have this 5-4 of clubs on the 8-7-6-9-3 board texture, and there's two components to that. So there's our absolute hand strength, which is that we have a straight, but then if we think about this spot in terms of relative hand strength, we actually have the bottom straight on a monotone and 4 to straight board. So even though we have a straight, the strength of that hand isn't exactly good. Next we have position, so advantages of being in position and out of position, understanding how position plays a role in your particular format, and realizing that our strategies need to be different when we're both in and out of position. And then like once you have that understanding, you can start to think about what adjustments need to be made based on that. But obviously, most of you know that being in position or last to act is an advantage in terms of the information you have on your opponent. Bankroll and risk management. So I play cash games, so specifically going to talk about cash games. Typically 40 buy-ins, and more if playing as only source of income, so more like 100 buy-ins if you're playing as your only source of income. Stop losses are a big one, so typically people play worse as they start to lose money during a session, so we should set stop losses to prevent disaster sessions where you lose your entire bankroll because you're playing on tilt. I've seen this happen a few times. I'll be playing against a recreational player or something, and then they'll just keep reloading and stay at the table for like 2 hours, and eventually they're busto. So usually quit for the day if we're down 3 to 5 buy-ins. This is applicable to regs as well. Like the thing is, your win rate is not going to be the same when you're losing compared to when you're concentrated, you're focused, and you're running pretty good. Generally, your win rate could be decreasing from either like crushing to break even, or even like marginally losing, depending on how severe the level of tilt you are has an impact on how you're playing. So like it doesn't have to be just that you're playing badly, but it can be because the tilt is affecting you in other ways as well, such as your concentration. So that more into that in the mental game section. But basically, last thing on risk management would probably be to have a guideline for the maximum amount of money you have before you leave a table. So Basically, this just helps you avoid playing in deep stack situations where you might not be correctly rolled for the swings, and the swings might affect your mental game. For me, when I'm playing zone poker, I just sit out whenever I have more than 200 big blinds as an example, or even if I like reach close to that amount. And for regular tables, it will usually be 400 big blinds for me. So if I'm up more than 4 buy-ins on the table, like, and I have that much on the table and someone else is deep stacked against me, then I'm just gonna leave the table. Math. Basically, this is a very fundamental component to poker, and without it you can't really make good decisions. So first few things to think about: effective stacks, pot odds and equity, and then finally expected value on combinatorics. So effective stack sizes, basically you can think of these in terms of big blinds or in terms of stack to pot ratio. Stack to pot ratio is probably the more relevant way to think about things, but it's also a bit more difficult. So typically we start by talking about how many big blinds deep we are, and typically most stack sizes in online games are 100 BB deep. Pot odds, how often do I need to win based on the odds I'm given? That's the question you should be asking. So that can be whether you're calling a bluff or facing, or like making a bluff yourself. So for example, what are my pot odds when facing a pot size bet on the river? Well, you can actually work that out mathematically. So you need to call 1 into a pot of like the initial pot, your opponent's bet, and also your call. So 1 divided by 3, which would be 33%. And B, if I bluff $10 into a pot of $30, how often do I need to get my opponent to fold to make this profitable? So we're calculating again the break-even percentage. So we bluff 10 into a pot of 30 plus 10, so 10 divided by 40 gives you 25%. So if we bluff this sizing, we only need to win at least 25% to break even. Equity and outs is the next one. Basically, equity is how often you're expected to win a given hand based on the hand strength, or like the hole cards that you have, the board texture, and your opponent's hole cards. And you can also convert this sometimes to outs when you're behind. So for example, if you have 4 outs to improve against your opponent, then typically you can use a shortcut called the rule of 4 and 2. So on the flop, you multiply the number of outs you have by 4, and if you're on the turn, you multiply it by 2. So for example, if you have 4 outs, you multiply that by 4, you now have around 16% equity. This is a good approximation, but it's not completely accurate, since as you start having more outs, the rule is a bit deviating from the actual percentage equity you have. Expected value, well, this is the average of an action or situation. So let's say we are all in with 80% equity in a pot of 100. Our expected value is $80, and in reality the outcome of the hand is actually either that we win 100 or we win 0. So EV is a measure of what's supposed to usually happen, but in poker usually you either win or lose the hand, so you either win the whole pot or you lose the whole pot. Combinatorics, so basically this is just understanding how many combinations of hands are possible. So 6 combinations of each paired hand are possible, 12 combinations of offsuit hands, and 4 combinations of suited hands. Basically, once you are trying to do more hand reading, you want to start thinking about combinatorics and basically working out how often your opponent may be bluffing, or maybe using combinatorics to work out how often you're, or how many combos you're allowed to bluff. Ranges, so basically I'm talking about preflop here at the start. Basically, when you're starting out, you need to start to learn what these hand matrices are. So on the right, we have a PO solver grid, which is just showing the ranges in a yellow color. And that would, for example, be something like an under the gun opening range, or a middle position opening range in 6 max, depending on how loose someone is. When you're starting out, you should definitely learn how to play well pre-flop when it comes to all the different spots that occur. So open raising being the first, free betting people in and out of position, big blind defense versus different sizes. Big blind events versus different sizes is a really big one, since you're not going to be always playing against someone that opens 2.5x or 3x. So you need to learn what kind of hands you can continue versus different sizings, and how you want to continue those, whether it's calling or free betting. And then finally, there's playing versus free bets. So when you open raise and someone free bets you, learning what kind of hands you're supposed to continue with will really greatly help your game. And once you have that pre-flop down and solid, then your post-flop will automatically be a lot more easier. And now we get to the post-flop part of ranges. So typically there's like 2 components of it. So there's c-betting in position versus out of position. Again, there's a very big difference between how you should play when you're the aggressor and you're in position, or when you're the aggressor and you're out of position. So when you're out of position, you actually need to be a lot more careful. You can't immediately see the turn card when you're on the flop if you're out of position, since your opponent can bet once you check, whereas that's not the case when you're in position. So when you're in position, you can always check back and see the turn, so you don't need to make a bet if you don't want to. So you don't need to increase the amount of money in the pot as a result of that. And what that means is typically the person in position will have more information and more control of the pot. So as a result, you need to be more careful out of position. And you also want to think about what kind of hands you put in both the check and bet ranges. Then we have playing versus c-bets. So typically you have 2 choices when someone bets into you, which is to either check raise or to check call, or also to fold. And trying to understand what type of hands go into which line or strategic option is really important, because you want to try to make the most money on average with a particular hand, and also think about your overall strategy to come up with that decision and how your opponents are playing. So being aware of how to play versus different bet sizings, or what kind of hands will go into different bet sizings that your opponent's using, will help you figure out what kind of hands you're meant to call and whether you're getting the right odds to call, and will realize enough equity. Next we have psychology. So exploiting common leaks and players, understanding tells and why they exist, interpreting bet sizes, and player profiling. So typically in terms of psychology, there's a center around player profiling that dictates the above 3 points. So typically the way I profile people is I'll either describe them as a weak or aggressive player, or like in between, right? And then they either go into a recreational player tag, so the fish, the maniac, or they go into a more like solid kind of player type, or regular type of player. So that can be a weak regular, a strong regular, or a nit. Basically, all those terms should be pretty straightforward. Weak just means that people are leaning towards a more passive strategy. Strong can mean that they're on the more aggressive side, or that they're playing a good strategy. And nit just means that they're tight. And basically, when you're trying to profile people, you can look at a lot of their hands and figure that out by looking at how they're playing them. So if you see a showdown, you would look at, okay, did this guy bet this hand aggressively or play it passively? Did he bluff this hand? Did he choose not to bluff a certain hand even though it would have been a hand he's supposed to bluff, and so on. And once you have that profile down, you can kind of figure out more about how they're playing using the psychology of the player profile. So for example, if you see a passive weak fish making a large bet, it's typically going to be telling you that he has a strong hand. Whereas that's not true if you're against an aggro maniac. He could just be betting large as a bluff to get you to fold. Next we have game theory concepts. So these are a bit more advanced. Once you have the hang of the basics and the psychology and you have a good fundamental grasp of the game, then you start to learn about game theory. And game theory is a lot around understanding the structure and rules of the game and how to use them to your advantage, as well as creating strategies against strong opponents that are basically trying to maximize their expectation against you by exploiting you. And what this leads to is it leads to something called the optimal bluffing frequency or optimal defense frequency, as well as the term Nash equilibrium. So I listed these 4 terms here. I'm not going to get too in-depth into them, but basically this is something for you to research once you have the hang of stuff. So you also want to understand the fact that the game is a multi-street betting game and a bluff catching game. So just because you have the odds to call a particular bet on the flop doesn't mean that it's a profitable call on the flop, since you can still face bets on the turn and river, since there is still money behind that people can use to leverage against you. And what that means is they're allowed to bluff more, and you're gonna have to fold more of your bluff catches, otherwise you'll be losing with them. Nash equilibrium, definitely search this term up, but basically it's a point at which no player can increase their EV by changing their strategy. So again, if we're playing optimally or GTO, game theory optimal, then our opponent can't increase their expectation by changing the strategy, so they have no incentive to deviate in what they're doing. Typically this doesn't really ever occur in poker, since people don't play anywhere near optimal, so it just doesn't apply all the time, but it can be useful to figure out, okay, what my optimal look like and how is my opponent deviating, and then next would be how do you exploit that. Finally, we have the term mixed strategy, which is basically when you have 2 options and you take both options at a certain frequency. So let's say you have aces and you face a 4-bet. Well, pre-flop, you at 100 big blinds deep, you could either go all in, i.e. 5-bet all in, or you could call the 4-bet. And a mixed strategy would be a strategy that does each action some percentage of the time. Finally, we have strategy development and execution before we get on to mental game, which will be kind of short for this video, but basically just remember the acronym SCARS. So what is SCARS? Well, it consists of a bunch of different terms, and I think these are all important for strategy development. I actually have a coaching session that I usually go through with people that talks about all of these in detail with examples, and usually it's in the context of using PO Solver. So first we have simplification, which is essentially just making it easier for yourself to implement your strategy. There's consistency, which is about how do you create a strategy that you can consistently implement so you can keep playing that strategy and you won't make as many mistakes over a long period of time. Accuracy, which is about, well, kind of similar to consistency, but it's more about, okay, if I'm given a particular strategy by someone or I design it myself, how likely am I to get this strategy wrong? So for example, if you're playing or trying to play like Pure Solver, your execution of that strategy would require you to remember the RNG and to remember the exact frequencies for different combinations, which could lead you to make mistakes when you're actually playing in-game and have limited time. Relevance, this is really about how incentivized a given strategy is when you're playing a certain player. So sometimes people get stuck trying to play GTO, they're trying to mix the strategy up and they're assuming the opponent is quite a good player, and in many cases it's just completely irrelevant to try to either bluff catch at the correct frequency or to bluff at the correct optimal frequency, because it's just not like necessary or relevant or important. So let's say you're playing against someone that you'll never play against, you know that they're always going to fold to your bluff because you have a particular read on them. You're not going to like bluff less than 100% of the time just because that's the game theory optimal solution or whatever, because you have additional information here that makes that irrelevant. So you're now just instead going to bluff the guy 100% because that maximizes your expectation. Now finally, there's sustainability. So this is about developing exploitative strategies that will continue to work against a given player pool or a given player. So if you play in a very obvious way, like let's say you bet big with value hands and you bet small when you're bluffing, then eventually people would catch on and the strategy would no longer be sustainable, so you'd have to start to change it. And this is basically the essence of sustainability. Once you have all that strategy down, basically, I feel like I've said basically a lot this video, but yeah, we're on mental game now. There's kind of 3 components to it, but there's a lot to break down. Like you could go way more in depth into this, but these are like the core elements and essential like components of mental game to think about. Again, this video is supposed to be a bit short and it's supposed to kind of just make you think about different parts of poker and how you relate to them and how well you're thinking about those spots, or like basically just providing you like a roadmap of things that you can work on, but not actually yet presenting like actual methodology for how to work on them. It's just like, let's say like an instruction manual, but just a table of contents. It's just gonna be too difficult for me to do a whole video on like everything and then try to cover everything in depth and give you strategy and give you like advice about that. That's why I usually do that through coaching, so feel free to message me if you're interested in that. So mental game. First we have focus, then we have consistency, and then we have thought management. So focus is how well you're able to recall information, pay attention to the table, and observing actions. So if you have low focus, then you're not gonna get all the information that you have available to you, and you're not going to be able to make the best decisions. So an example of this is, let's say you open raise preflop, someone bets the turn, you call, they bet the river, they go all in on the river, and then you have a decision. Well, you now need to try to recall how much, like what position they raised from preflop. You also want to recall how big they bet on the turn. And basically, if you're not focus, then you're likely going to have completely forgotten what just happened in the previous streets. So a lot of people end up having that happen to them when they're multi-tabling, so they'll just all of a sudden be on the river and they can't remember what happened, and the guy bets really big and they're not sure what to do. Well, usually if you had more focus, then you would be able to make a much better decision because you know what happened on the previous betting streets. Consistency is how well you can execute your strategy without making mistakes. So I mentioned that in the previous strategy development component, that it's also a mental game thing. So let's say you're playing 8 hours straight and you have not had a break. Think about a complicated strategy that involves a lot of range mixing, where you use a random number generator to try to play like Pio Solver and get the right frequency. If you've been playing for 8 hours straight, you're not likely to be in a mental state that you can recall all this information correctly and implement it correctly. So you're going to start making mistakes with your strategy and lose accuracy. So when you create consistency by simplifying your strategy, that's when you're able to make a lot less mistakes and keep playing that strategy. So that's why I'd had that whole like slide there before. And in terms of a mental game kind of thing, you actually want to think a lot more about how consistent you can implement or play. So if you're just starting out, you might not even remember what your open raising range is or your free betting range is in a given spot at any time, so you might have a hand and you're not sure. That's kind of to do with consistency. So consistency comes with playing just a large amount of hands and also just experience. So when you're starting out in any kind of skill, you're not going to be consistent when you start out. Like, let's say you're trying to consistently serve into like the service box when you're playing tennis. When you start out, you're gonna keep hitting the ball out just because you don't have any control of your like dexterity in terms of your hand-eye coordination and the amount of and you don't know how much strength you're supposed to exert onto the tennis ball. And to get rid of that inconsistency, you just basically just practice and practice and practice. Kind of same thing for poker. The more you play, the more consistent you'll likely end up being. And it's a big component of mental game as well, because let's say you're on tilt, well you're likely to lose consistency. So that gets onto the tilt management aspect, which is just really important in terms of how you can maintain the above two concepts of focus and consistency. So when you're no longer like playing your best game, you need to be able to be self-aware of that and just leave the table when this happens. Sometimes you're in a situation where you're not able to do that, and this kind of just forces you to learn how to manage your tilt better so that you can continue playing. So that can be through doing deep breaths, that can be doing some kind of quick meditation, or having like a mantra of some sort, or even an affirmation that basically just tries to re-establish your mental state. One thing you start to experience as you play more and more poker and you become quite skilled at it is you end up in a flow state, and what happens is your flow state will just give you automatic focus and consistency in how you're playing, and you'll actually feel pretty good about that. It's really important that you try to learn more about flow states. I probably should have included that in the slide, but unfortunately I won't be able to. But basically, learn about flow states and understand how they can be applied to poker, and use them to your advantage. So one way you would do that would be to create a more consistent warm-up routine, for example, and that basically is a similar thing to what athletes do. Is they try to get into the zone before they have that big race or that big competition, and you can do the same thing with poker as long as you have a good routine. Alright, so that basically wraps up the presentation. No more slides from me. Hope you guys enjoyed it. I will probably make more content around this kind of thing, but again, I can't just like go through everything in like a short period of time and just cover all aspects of poker. It's just like not possible. But this hopefully will provide you with some ideas and things to think about and potentially explore. So see you in the next video. I'm looking forward to making more of these. I think it's a bit better than just doing a typical like live play kind of thing. So practicing my presentation skills a bit with this kind of video. Definitely subscribe, leave a comment, ask any questions you have, and stay tuned for the next video.